All right, we are back for the last lecture of chapter 7. Yay, yay, yay. And at this point, we're going to be talking about the fact that you don't just eat sugar. And so glucose, which is the starting substrate for glycolysis, isn't the only food you ever eat. Your diet consists of proteins, carbohydrates, fats, and of course, nucleic acids are in the food that you eat. And most of these, so proteins, carbohydrates, and fats especially, all have energy stored in the chemical bonds. Now, one of the things that sometimes students get confused about is the difference between digestion and metabolism. Okay, so digestion begins in your mouth when you start chewing. So in your saliva, there is an enzyme called salivary amylase that starts breaking down the bonds in long chain carbohydrates. And then as you swallow and that food goes into your stomach, your stomach is churning and grinding, and there's enzymes in your stomach that start breaking down the peptide bonds and proteins. And then that food goes on into your small intestine, where additional breakdown happens. And then, those small units that make up food, like individual amino acids or two amino acids linked together, or fatty acids, or, sugar molecules, those are then absorbed from the small intestine into the bloodstream, where they enter your cells, and your cells then begin metabolism, where they are breaking down those building blocks of food into or through aerobic respiration in order to pull that energy out. So digestion begins in the mouth, it continues in the stomach and small intestine. Nutrients are absorbed into the blood from the small intestine. And then the rest of the undigestible parts of the food that you eat are then excreted through the large intestine and out of your body. Once those nutrients, those building blocks are absorbed, they all have to enter aerobic respiration, but they're going to enter at different parts or different places. So if we look at this figure over here, glucose is the starting product or the starting substrate of glycolysis. Well, glucose isn't the only kind of monosaccharide. There are other kinds of monosaccharides like fructose and galactose, and those will enter glycolysis, but they're not going to enter at the very top because fructose isn't the same as glucose. Fructose cannot undergo the first few reactions of glycolysis because it doesn't have the same shape as glucose. So there are other reactions that have to happen to prep some of those other carbohydrates before they can enter aerobic respiration. And so that's why you see this side arrow here, that other carbohydrates are going to enter glycolysis, but they're going to enter a little bit further down, okay? Well, what about proteins? You know that proteins are made up of amino acids. As the peptide bonds are broken and those amino acids are released, some amino acids can be converted directly into pyruvate. Pyruvate then, as you know, diffuses into the mitochondria where it's oxidized into acetyl-CoA, and then acetyl-CoA turns the Krebs cycle one time. Well, we get a little bit of energy out of the oxidation of pyruvate, and NADH comes out of there, okay? Other amino acids are converted into acetyl-CoA. Well, amino acids that enter the pathway right here, they're going to have a little bit less energy to offer than the ones that enter as pyruvate, because from pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, we get an NADH, okay? But amino acids that enter here with acetyl-CoA still have enough energy to turn the Krebs cycle one time. Other amino acids, their byproducts can't enter until late in the Krebs cycle. So there's only one reaction left to pull NADH, to pull some energy out of them. But every little bit of energy can be beneficial to cells and to organisms, okay? Well, fats, on the other hand, carry a lot of energy, and most of the breakdown of fats is going to enter the aerobic respiration pathway right here at acetyl-CoA. Remember, acetyl-CoA is a 2-carbon molecule that then has that CoA attached to it, okay? So you may remember from health class that those different macromolecules, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, all have different amounts of energy that they carry. And so you may have learned that carbs and proteins carry about 4 calories per gram, whereas fats carry 9 calories per gram, okay? So fats are higher in energy than carbohydrates and proteins. Well, if you remember when we talked about lipids, we talked about the fact that triacylglycerols, or fatty acids, have a glycerol backbone, and I'm not going to worry about drawing this exactly accurately, okay? But they have this glycerol backbone, and then attached to it is the fatty acid, which then has these long chains of carbons. And there are 3 of them for each fat molecule. When fat is broken down through a process called beta oxidation, these fatty acids are broken off in 2 carbon units, okay? Well, what did we learn that has 2 carbons? Acetyl-CoA. So each one of these 2 carbon units can be combined with with coenzyme A to form acetyl-CoA, which then enters the Krebs cycle. Okay, well, how many acetyl-CoAs do you get per glucose? You get 2. How many acetyl-CoAs did we just get from one fatty acid that had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 carbons? We got 4. And most fatty acids are longer than 8 carbons, and every fat molecule has 3 fatty acids, okay? So you can see, hopefully, why there's so much energy stored in fats, okay? Because there's the potential for so many acetyl-CoAs to come out of those fat molecules, and each acetyl-CoA is going to turn the Krebs cycle one time. Where did we say most of the energy is harvested in aerobic respiration? From the Krebs cycle, okay? So there's lots of energy harvested out of acetyl-CoA. I don't think I need those extra slides. Okay. Organisms will often have extra nutrients that they take in that they don't need to metabolize for energy right away. Okay, so we have the ability, animals and plants and other organisms, fungi, have the ability to take excess glucose and convert that excess glucose into storage polysaccharides. Well, poly just means many, and it's just many glucoses hooked together. So plants make starch, and starches are polysaccharides. So you know that starchy vegetables like potatoes and carrots, they have a lot of starch in them. They have a lot of carbs. If you're on a low carb diet, you're not supposed to eat a lot of potatoes, a lot of rice, those kinds of things, because of all of the starch. Well, starch is just what the plants form when they are storing their excess glucose. Well, animals also store excess glucose, except we store it in the form of glycogen. Okay, still just a bunch of glucoses hooked together. The shape of the storage polysaccharides for plants and animals differs a little bit. I'm not going to get into the details about that. Animals that eat plants can break down these starches to release the individual glucose units that can then enter glycolysis. Animals can store excess glucose in muscle cells and in the liver. And so when an animal needs to, say, do fight or flight, they can access those stored carbohydrates for a quick burst of energy. Okay? Now, plants also make another kind of storage polysaccharide called cellulose. Cellulose is found in plant cell walls. It's the main component in, or one of the main components in wood. Animals cannot digest cellulose. So you think about all the cows out in the fields eating grass. That's their main diet. Does it make sense that all of these energy-rich carbohydrates are just going to pass right through their systems? Well, it doesn't, okay? So herbivores, animals that only eat plants, they have symbiotic relationships. Symbiotic means mutually beneficial, with bacteria that live in the guts of those animals. And the bacteria can break the bonds in cellulose to release the glucose that the animals can then absorb and metabolize. It's mutually beneficial for the animals and the bacteria. The animals have more access to energy than they would without the bacteria. The bacteria have a nice, warm, protected, cozy place to live and ready access to food. So you think about termites that eat wood. Well, termites also have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in their guts that break down the cellulose in the wood. Okay, so just some really interesting kinds of biology going on there. Humans do not have those symbiotic relationships with those particular bacteria. We cannot digest cellulose. So cellulose is part of our diet that we eliminate in our fecal matter. We cannot digest that cellulose, okay? When organisms break down their polysaccharides, that feeds into glycolysis. So when glucose is released, it's going to enter glycolysis. So you might think then that all of our stored energy is in the form of glycogen, but it's not, okay? There's a limit to how much glycogen animals have the ability to store, and we typically burn through our glycogen stores in about 24 hours. Even like marathon runners who carb load and stuff before marathons, they're going to burn through their glycogen pretty quickly. Animals store excess energy as fat. So regardless of the original food source, whether it was fats, proteins, carbohydrates, Animals have the ability to take excess acetyl-CoA and build it into fat. So if we go back to this figure over here, acetyl-CoA right here, we can get acetyl-CoA from carbohydrate metabolism, from protein metabolism, from fat metabolism. When an organism has a sufficient supply of energy and they have excess energy that they need to store, excess food metabolites that they need to store, then this process goes the other way, and that acetyl-CoA is converted into fat. Again, once it's in the form of acetyl-CoA, it doesn't matter if it started off as protein, carbohydrate, or fat. Excess is going to be stored as fat. And that's just something that we all need to think about when we're thinking about our diets. Some of us, like me, need to think about that more than others. So anyway, this is the end of chapter 7. Please reach out to me if you have questions, and we'll be moving